Frank Sullivan called his wife from a truck stop payphone on March 12, 1994. He said he'd found something that would make the company pay for what they're doing to Alaska. His truck was pulled from a frozen lake 3 days later. Frank's body was never found. The wind cut through the Alaskan wilderness like a knife as Margaret Sullivan hung up the phone in her modest Fairbanks home. Her husband's voice had been different during that last call, urgent in a way she'd rarely heard in their 23 years of marriage. Frank Sullivan wasn't a man given to dramatics or wild theories. He was methodical, careful, and honest to a fault. When he said something was wrong, something was very wrong indeed. Frank had been driving Alaska's most treacherous highways for Northern Transport Solutions for nearly 15 years, ever since returning from his second tour in Vietnam with a Purple Heart and a determination to provide for his family through honest work. At 62, he should have been thinking about retirement, but medical bills from Margaret's cancer treatment 3 years earlier had drained their savings. Every mile Frank drove on Alaska's deadly ice roads brought them one step closer to financial stability and one step closer to the peaceful retirement they'd dreamed of together. Northern Transport Solutions had hired Frank in 1979 specifically because of his military background and impeccable safety record. The company specialized in hauling construction materials, mining equipment, and industrial supplies to Alaska's most remote locations. It was dangerous work that required nerves of steel, mechanical expertise, and an intimate knowledge of Alaska's ever-changing road conditions. Frank possessed all three qualities in abundance. The routes Frank drove would have terrified most professional truckers. He regularly navigated the Dalton Highway, a 414-mile stretch of road that climbed from sea level to 4,800 feet above sea level, crossed the Arctic Circle, and connected civilization to the industrial complexes of Alaska's North Slope. In winter, temperatures along this route could drop to minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit, and wind speeds could exceed 70 miles per hour. Vehicle breakdowns in such conditions weren't inconveniences. They were potential death sentences. But Frank Sullivan had mastered these challenges through decades of experience and meticulous preparation. He knew every truck stop, every dangerous curve, every stretch of road where ice formed first and melted last. Other drivers sought his advice and looked to him as an unofficial leader within Northern Transport Solutions' small fraternity of long-haul specialists. Frank's blue Kenworth, meticulously maintained and equipped with every available safety device, had become a familiar and reassuring sight along Alaska's most isolated highways. The relationship between Frank and Northern Transport Solutions had always been professional and mutually beneficial. The company paid well for the dangerous work, and Frank delivered their cargo safely and on schedule. He asked few questions about the specifics of what he was hauling, trusting that the manifests accurately described his loads and that company management was handling all necessary permits and regulatory compliance. For nearly 15 years, this arrangement had worked perfectly for everyone involved. Margaret had learned not to worry too much about Frank's long absences on dangerous routes. He was too experienced and too careful to take unnecessary risks, and he always called when he could to let her know he was safe. But something about his voice during that final call had been different. There had been an edge of excitement mixed with anger and an urgency she'd never heard before. Frank had said he would be home in 3 days with news that would change everything for them. He told her not to worry, but to be ready for some difficult conversations ahead. That was the last time Margaret Sullivan heard her husband's voice. Frank's final cargo assignment had seemed routine by Northern Transport Solutions standards. He was scheduled to transport construction materials from Fairbanks to a remote industrial site near the Arctic Circle. The manifest described his load as concrete mix, reinforcing materials, and industrial chemicals used in foundation work. It was the kind of shipment Frank had delivered hundreds of times before, hauling supplies to mining operations, construction projects, and research facilities scattered across Alaska's vast wilderness. The destination was a coordinates-based location rather than a named facility, but this wasn't unusual for Frank's assignments. Many of the sites he serviced were temporary operations or classified government facilities that didn't appear on standard maps. Frank had learned not to ask too many questions about such destinations, understanding that discretion was part of what Northern Transport Solutions paid him to provide. Frank had loaded his truck at Northern Transport Solutions' secure warehouse on the outskirts of Fairbanks just after dawn on March 10, 1994. The loading process had been supervised by company personnel, and Frank had been instructed not to inspect the cargo personally. This directive struck him as slightly unusual, but not unprecedented for sensitive or classified materials. Frank had simply verified that the load was properly secured and balanced before beginning his journey north. The first day of the trip had proceeded normally. Frank made good time on the clear highways leading out of Fairbanks, and weather conditions were favorable for the challenging drive ahead. He stopped for the night at a truck stop he'd used many times before, conducting his routine evening inspection of his vehicle and checking weather forecasts for the route ahead. Everything appeared normal, and Frank settled in for a few hours of sleep before continuing north. It was during his second day on the road that Frank first noticed something was wrong with his cargo. Frank had stopped to check his load securement at a remote pull-off about 200 miles north of Fairbanks. As he walked around his trailer conducting his routine inspection, he noticed a small puddle of liquid beneath the cargo area. At first, Frank assumed it was melted ice or condensation, but when he knelt down to examine the liquid more closely, he realized it was something far more concerning. The liquid was thick, yellowish-green in color, and gave off a chemical odor that made Frank's eyes water. When a few drops splashed onto his work gloves, the material began to smoke and deteriorate. Frank quickly removed his gloves and threw them aside, watching in shock as the leather continued to dissolve where the liquid had made contact. Whatever was in his trailer, it definitely wasn't concrete mix. Frank's military training had included exposure to various chemical agents, and he recognized the signs of a highly corrosive industrial chemical. The liquid was clearly leaking from one of the containers in his cargo bay, and if it continued to leak, it could eat through the floor of his trailer and potentially damage his truck's fuel tanks or other critical systems. More importantly, Frank realized that whatever this substance was, it was far too dangerous to be transported without proper hazardous materials protocols and safety equipment. Frank used his CB radio to contact Northern Transport Solutions dispatch office, reporting the leak and requesting instructions on how to proceed. The dispatcher, a man Frank didn't recognize, seemed unconcerned about the situation and instructed Frank to continue to his destination as planned. When Frank pressed for more information about the nature of the chemical and proper cleanup procedures, the dispatcher became evasive and eventually ended the conversation abruptly. This response troubled Frank deeply. In 15 years of hauling potentially dangerous cargo for Northern Transport Solutions, the company had always prioritized safety and regulatory compliance above all else. The casual dismissal of a hazardous materials leak was completely out of character and violated numerous federal transportation regulations that Frank was required to follow. Frank decided to conduct his own investigation of the cargo. Using bolt cutters he carried for emergency situations, Frank carefully opened one of the shipping containers in his trailer. What he found inside confirmed his worst suspicions and revealed something far more sinister than a simple documentation error. The container held dozens of 50-gallon drums, each labeled with cryptic numerical codes rather than proper chemical identification markings. Many of the drums showed signs of corrosion and previous leaking, suggesting they'd been improperly stored for extended periods. Frank opened one of the drums and immediately recognized the distinctive smell and appearance of industrial waste products he'd encountered during his military service. The contents appeared to be a mixture of various toxic chemicals, including what looked like heavy metals, solvents, and other hazardous substances that required special handling and disposal procedures. Frank realized he wasn't hauling construction materials to a legitimate job site. He was transporting toxic waste to an illegal dumping operation. The coordinates for Frank's destination led to a location deep in Alaska's wilderness, far from any industrial facilities or proper waste treatment plants. Frank began to understand that Northern Transport Solutions was using him to secretly dispose of dangerous chemicals in Alaska's protected wilderness areas, potentially contaminating groundwater, killing wildlife, and creating environmental hazards that could last for decades. Frank's sense of betrayal was overwhelming. He'd trusted Northern Transport Solutions to operate legally and ethically, and he'd unknowingly participated in what appeared to be systematic environmental destruction. Worse, the company had deliberately deceived him about the nature of his cargo, putting him at risk of chemical exposure and making him an unwitting accomplice to serious federal crimes. Frank knew he had to act, but he also understood the dangers involved. Northern Transport Solutions was a large company with significant political and economic influence in Alaska. If they were willing to engage in illegal waste disposal, they would certainly be willing to silence a truck driver who threatened to expose their operation. Frank needed evidence and he needed allies before he could safely blow the whistle on what he'd discovered. Frank used his knowledge of Alaska's highway system to deviate from his assigned route and drive to a location where he could safely document the toxic cargo. Using a camera he'd brought to take pictures of the scenic drive for Margaret, Frank methodically photographed the leaking drums, the corroded containers, and the false shipping manifests. He collected samples of the leaking chemicals in small containers, carefully sealing them for later analysis. Most importantly, Frank began documenting everything he knew about Northern Transport Solutions operations. He wrote detailed notes about his previous cargo assignments, trying to identify other shipments that might have involved similar illegal waste disposal. Frank realized that over the years, he'd probably transported thousands of gallons of toxic waste to remote locations across Alaska, unknowingly participating in one of the largest environmental crimes in the state's history. The scope of the operation was staggering. Frank's records showed that he'd made dozens of trips to coordinates-based destinations that weren't listed in any official databases. Many of these locations were near sensitive ecological areas, including wildlife refuges, watershed protection zones, and Native American tribal lands. If all of these sites had been used for toxic waste disposal, the environmental damage could be catastrophic and irreversible. Frank understood that he was now in possession of evidence that could destroy Northern Transport Solutions and potentially implicate other companies and government officials in a massive conspiracy. He also knew that this evidence made him a target for people who had already demonstrated their willingness to break the law on a massive scale. That evening, Frank called Margaret from a truck stop payphone. "Margaret, it's me. Listen carefully because I don't have much time." Frank's voice was steady but urgent. "I've found something big. Something that's going to make the company pay for what they're doing to Alaska." Margaret could hear the tension in her husband's voice. "Frank, what are you talking about? You're scaring me. I can't explain everything over the phone, but I've discovered that Northern Transport Solutions has been using me to dump toxic waste all over Alaska. I'm talking about chemicals that could poison groundwater and kill wildlife for decades. I've got evidence, photographs, samples, everything we need to shut them down and make them pay for the cleanup." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with Alaska's winter weather. "Frank, if what you're saying is true, you could be in real danger. These people won't just let you expose them. I know the risks, but I can't let this continue. I've been unknowingly poisoning the land we love for years. I have to make this right, no matter what it costs me personally." Frank explained his plan to Margaret. He would complete his current delivery to avoid arousing suspicion, but instead of dumping the toxic waste at the coordinates he'd been given, he would secure the evidence and drive directly to the EPA office in Anchorage. He'd already contacted an environmental lawyer through a payphone at another truck stop, and arrangements were being made to ensure his evidence would be protected even if something happened to him. "I'll be home in 3 days," Frank promised his wife, "and when I get there, we'll have enough money from the whistleblower settlement to pay off all our debts and retire comfortably." The EPA pays substantial rewards for evidence of environmental crimes this serious. Margaret begged her husband to abandon the dangerous cargo and come home immediately, but Frank was determined to see his plan through. He'd spent too many years unknowingly participating in environmental destruction, and he couldn't live with himself if he walked away without trying to make things right. "I love you, Margaret. Tell the kids I'm proud of them, and remember that everything I'm doing is for our family and for Alaska." That was the last conversation Margaret Sullivan ever had with her husband. Frank never made it to the EPA office in Anchorage. On March 15, 1994, his truck was found at the bottom of a frozen lake approximately 50 miles from his intended destination. The official investigation concluded that Frank had lost control of his vehicle on an icy curve and crashed through the ice into the deep water below. His body was never recovered from the frigid depths, and the toxic cargo he'd been carrying was never found. The Alaska State Police classified Frank's death as a tragic accident caused by hazardous driving conditions and driver fatigue. Northern Transport Solutions expressed condolences to Frank's family and paid out his life insurance policy without delay. The company's representatives attended Frank's memorial service and praised his 15 years of dedicated service to the organization. But Margaret Sullivan never believed the official explanation of her husband's death. Margaret knew Frank better than anyone, and she knew he was far too experienced and careful to lose control of his truck on a road he'd driven safely hundreds of times before. Frank had been driving Alaska's most dangerous highways for decades without a serious accident. The idea that he would suddenly make a fatal error on a relatively minor curve struck her as impossible. More suspicious was the fact that Frank's truck had been found so far from his intended destination. According to Northern Transport Solutions, Frank was supposed to be delivering his cargo to a construction site north of his actual crash location. There was no logical reason for him to have deviated from his assigned route, especially given his meticulous approach to following company protocols. Margaret hired a private investigator to look into the circumstances of Frank's death, but the investigation was hampered by lack of access to evidence and uncooperative witnesses. Northern Transport Solutions claimed that all records of Frank's final cargo assignment had been destroyed in a routine file purging, and the company's employees who had worked with Frank seemed reluctant to discuss the details of his last trip. The private investigator did discover some troubling inconsistencies in the official accident report. The Alaska State Police had concluded their investigation unusually quickly for such a serious incident, and several standard investigative procedures appeared to have been skipped or rushed. Most significantly, no attempt had been made to recover Frank's cargo from the lake, despite environmental regulations requiring cleanup of any hazardous materials that might have been released in the crash. Margaret spent the next several years fighting for a more thorough investigation of her husband's death. She contacted federal environmental agencies, congressional representatives, and environmental advocacy groups, trying to find someone willing to investigate her claims about Northern Transport Solutions' illegal waste disposal operation. But without Frank's evidence, which had disappeared with him, Margaret had little more than suspicions and inconsistencies to support her allegations. Northern Transport Solutions weathered Margaret's accusations without difficulty. The company maintained that Frank Sullivan had been a valued employee who had tragically died in a workplace accident, and they denied any involvement in illegal environmental activities. Company executives expressed sympathy for Margaret's grief and suggested that her conspiracy theories were the result of her inability to accept the random tragedy that had taken her husband's life. As the years passed, Margaret's campaign for justice gradually lost momentum. Her financial resources were exhausted by legal fees and private investigator costs, and her health began to suffer from the stress of her long battle against powerful corporate interests. Friends and family members, while sympathetic to her loss, began to suggest that she should accept the official explanation and try to move on with her life. But Margaret Sullivan never gave up her belief that her husband had been murdered to prevent him from exposing Northern Transport Solutions' environmental crimes. In 2005, 11 years after Frank Sullivan's death, climate change and an unusually warm spring began to affect Alaska's permafrost and ice formations in unprecedented ways. Lakes that had been frozen solid for decades started thawing earlier and more completely than anyone could remember. Scientists studying these changes made numerous discoveries of historical artifacts and environmental contamination that had been preserved beneath Alaska's ice for years or even decades. Dr. Sarah Chen, an environmental scientist with the University of Alaska, was conducting a routine water quality survey near the lake where Frank Sullivan had died when she made a discovery that would finally vindicate Margaret's decade-long fight for justice. As the spring thaw progressed more rapidly than usual, the water level in the lake dropped significantly, exposing areas of the lake bottom that had been submerged since Frank's death. What Dr. Chen found scattered across the newly exposed lake bottom would restart the Frank Sullivan investigation and expose one of Alaska's largest environmental scandals. The retreating waters revealed dozens of corroded metal drums partially buried in the lake sediment, exactly matching Frank's description of the toxic waste containers he'd been transporting. The drums had been leaking their contents into the lake ecosystem for over a decade, creating a contamination plume that extended for miles downstream and had killed thousands of fish, birds, and other wildlife. Dr. Chen immediately contacted environmental authorities and law enforcement agencies. Within days, a multi-agency investigation team was examining the contaminated lake and its surroundings. What they discovered exceeded even Margaret Sullivan's worst suspicions about her husband's death and Northern Transport Solutions' criminal activities. The investigation revealed that the lake had been used as an illegal, toxic waste dumping site for nearly 20 years. Chemical analysis of the contamination showed evidence of industrial solvents, heavy metals, pesticides, and other hazardous substances that should have been disposed of at licensed hazardous waste facilities. The volume of contamination suggested that hundreds of illegal dumping operations had taken place at the site. Most significantly, investigators found Frank Sullivan's truck at the bottom of the lake, along with evidence that would finally prove Margaret's allegations about her husband's murder. The truck's cab had been crushed by the impact with the lake bottom, but the cargo area was largely intact. Inside, investigators found the camera Frank had used to document the illegal cargo, its film miraculously preserved by the cold water. When the film was developed, it provided clear photographic evidence of the toxic waste drums and false shipping manifests that Frank had discovered. Also found in the truck were Frank's handwritten notes detailing Northern Transport Solutions' illegal operations, including names, dates, locations, and other specific information that could be used to trace the full scope of the environmental conspiracy. Frank had been meticulous in documenting everything he knew, apparently anticipating that his evidence might be needed even if he didn't survive to present it himself. But perhaps the most damning evidence was found in Frank's personal effects. Hidden in a waterproof container beneath the truck's seat, investigators discovered audio recordings that Frank had made during his final days. The recordings captured conversations between Frank and Northern Transport Solutions personnel that clearly demonstrated the company's knowledge of the illegal waste disposal operations. The audio evidence proved that Frank's death had not been an accident. The recordings included a threatening phone conversation with a Northern Transport Solutions executive who explicitly warned Frank to keep quiet and complete his delivery or face serious consequences. The executive specifically mentioned Frank's family and suggested that their safety could not be guaranteed if Frank continued to ask questions about his cargo. The investigation that followed Frank Sullivan's posthumous evidence revelation became one of the largest environmental crime prosecutions in Alaska history. Northern Transport Solutions executives were charged with conspiracy, environmental terrorism, racketeering, and murder. The evidence Frank had risked his life to gather ultimately led to convictions for 12 company officials and the complete shutdown of the organization. The environmental cleanup at the lake and dozens of other contaminated sites across Alaska cost over $200 million and took nearly 5 years to complete. Thousands of wildlife had been killed by the toxic contamination, and several Native American communities had suffered health problems from contaminated groundwater. The full extent of the environmental damage would never be completely known, but Frank's evidence had prevented decades of additional contamination from continuing. Margaret Sullivan finally received the justice she had fought for during 11 years of legal battles and personal sacrifice. Northern Transport Solutions insurance companies paid substantial settlements to Frank's family and to the environmental victims of the illegal dumping operations. Margaret used part of the settlement money to establish the Frank Sullivan Environmental Protection Foundation, which provides funding for whistleblower protections and environmental enforcement in Alaska. At the criminal trials, prosecutors presented Frank Sullivan as a hero who had died trying to protect Alaska's wilderness from corporate environmental criminals. The evidence he had gathered single-handedly had exposed a conspiracy that might have continued for decades if he hadn't been willing to risk everything to do the right thing. Frank's children, now adults with families of their own, attended the trials and watched as the people responsible for their father's death were finally brought to justice. They learned details about their father's final days that filled them with pride in his courage and determination to protect the environment he loved, even when he knew it might cost him his life. Margaret Sullivan, now in her 70s, finally achieved the peace that had eluded her for over a decade. Frank's name was cleared of any suggestion that he had died due to his own negligence, and his reputation as a careful, professional driver was vindicated. More importantly, his sacrifice had prevented immeasurable environmental damage and had protected countless Alaskans from the health effects of toxic contamination. The Frank Sullivan case became a landmark in environmental law and corporate accountability. Law schools began using the case as an example of how individual courage and determination could overcome corporate conspiracy and government indifference. Environmental groups held Frank up as a martyr who had died protecting Alaska's wilderness, and several environmental awards and scholarships were established in his memory. But for Margaret Sullivan, the most important outcome of the long legal battle was simpler and more personal. She finally knew the truth about what had happened to her husband, and she knew that his death had not been in vain. Frank Sullivan had died as he had lived, doing the right thing regardless of the personal cost, and his sacrifice had made Alaska a safer and cleaner place for future generations. The investigation into Northern Transport Solutions revealed layers of corruption that extended far beyond a single company's illegal waste disposal operation. Federal prosecutors discovered that the toxic dumping conspiracy involved a network of corporations, government officials, and organized crime figures who had been systematically poisoning Alaska's environment for profit while covering up their crimes through intimidation and murder. Court documents revealed that Northern Transport Solutions had been working with at least 6 other companies to dispose of toxic waste from industrial operations across the Pacific Northwest. These companies had been generating hundreds of thousands of gallons of hazardous waste annually, but instead of paying for proper disposal at licensed facilities, they had been shipping their toxic materials to Alaska for illegal dumping in remote wilderness areas. The financial scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Proper disposal of the toxic chemicals would have cost the participating companies over $50 million annually. By dumping the waste illegally in Alaska, they were able to reduce their disposal costs by more than 90% while generating substantial additional profits. The money saved through illegal dumping had been used to pay bribes to government inspectors, fund political campaigns, and hire criminal associates to eliminate threats to the operation. Frank Sullivan hadn't been the first person to discover the illegal dumping operation, and he hadn't been the first to die because of his knowledge. Investigators found evidence that at least 4 other truck drivers had been killed over the previous decade when they had asked too many questions about their cargo or tried to report environmental violations. These deaths had all been disguised as accidents, and the official investigations had been deliberately sabotaged by corrupt officials. The most shocking discovery was that Frank's immediate supervisor at Northern Transport Solutions, a man named Robert Hayes, who had been Frank's friend for over 10 years, had been the one who had ordered Frank's murder. Hayes had been receiving substantial payments from the waste disposal conspiracy in exchange for recruiting reliable drivers and ensuring their silence about questionable cargo assignments. Hayes had initially tried to convince Frank to ignore what he had discovered, offering him substantial bonuses and even threatening to fire him if he continued to ask questions. But when Frank had made it clear that he intended to expose the illegal operation regardless of the consequences, Hayes had contacted his criminal associates and arranged for Frank's death to look like an accident. The betrayal by Robert Hayes had been particularly devastating for Margaret Sullivan when she learned about it during the trials. Hayes had attended Frank's funeral, had expressed condolences to the family, and had even contributed money to a memorial fund established in Frank's honor. Margaret had considered Hayes a friend of the family, and learning that he had been responsible for her husband's murder added an additional layer of pain to her already overwhelming grief. Hayes eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy and murder charges in exchange for a sentence of life imprisonment without possibility of parole. During his sentencing hearing, he offered a brief apology to Frank's family, but Margaret refused to acknowledge his words. She told reporters that Hayes' betrayal of their friendship made his crime even more unforgivable than the actions of strangers who had participated in the conspiracy. The investigation also revealed the sophisticated methods that the toxic waste conspiracy had used to avoid detection by environmental regulators. The participating companies had created false documentation for their waste shipments, bribed government inspectors to ignore violations, and used their political connections to influence the assignment of oversight responsibilities to corrupt officials who would protect their interests. Northern Transport Solutions had been designated as a trusted carrier by several government agencies, which allowed the company to transport hazardous materials with reduced inspections and oversight. This designation had been obtained through political connections and bribes, and it had provided the perfect cover for transporting illegal toxic waste without detection. The conspiracy had also used sophisticated geographic analysis to select dumping sites that would be unlikely to be discovered by authorities or environmental monitors. They had targeted remote areas that were rarely visited by government personnel, and they had avoided locations near population centers where contamination might be quickly detected through health problems or environmental damage. But the criminal network had made a crucial error by targeting areas near sensitive ecological zones where environmental scientists regularly conducted research. Dr. Sarah Chen's discovery of the contaminated lake had been possible only because the University of Alaska had been conducting long-term climate change studies in that specific region. If the dumping site had been located just a few miles away, the contamination might never have been discovered. The trial of the Northern Transport Solutions conspirators became a media sensation that attracted national attention to Alaska's environmental challenges. Environmental groups used the case to highlight the ongoing threats posed by corporate pollution, while law enforcement agencies pointed to the investigation as an example of how federal cooperation could overcome local corruption and bring powerful criminals to justice. The surviving families of the murdered truck drivers filed a massive civil lawsuit against all of the companies involved in the toxic waste conspiracy. The lawsuit demanded not only monetary damages for their losses, but also funding for a comprehensive environmental cleanup program and the establishment of stronger protections for whistleblowers in Alaska's industrial sector. The civil case took nearly 3 years to resolve, but ultimately resulted in a settlement of over $400 million paid by the participating companies and their insurance carriers. Margaret Sullivan and the other families used substantial portions of their settlements to fund environmental advocacy organizations and to establish scholarship programs for students studying environmental protection and workplace safety. Margaret's activism following Frank's death had transformed her from a quiet homemaker into a nationally recognized advocate for environmental justice and worker protection. She testified before Congress about the need for stronger environmental enforcement, spoke at universities about the importance of whistleblower protections, and worked with environmental groups to identify and investigate other potential toxic waste conspiracies. Her transformation from grieving widow to powerful advocate had been difficult and painful, but Margaret had found purpose in ensuring that Frank's death would lead to meaningful changes that would protect other families from similar tragedies. She often told audiences that Frank would have been proud to know that his sacrifice had inspired others to fight for environmental protection and corporate accountability. The Frank Sullivan case also led to significant changes in how Alaska regulates trucking companies and monitors the transportation of hazardous materials. New regulations required more frequent inspections of trucks carrying potentially dangerous cargo, and stronger penalties were established for companies that falsified shipping documentation or violated environmental laws. Federal environmental agencies established a special task force dedicated to investigating illegal waste disposal operations, and new funding was provided for environmental monitoring in Alaska's remote wilderness areas. The task force was specifically charged with identifying other toxic dumping sites and prosecuting the individuals and companies responsible for environmental crimes. The cleanup of the contaminated lake where Frank died became a model for environmental restoration efforts throughout Alaska. Scientists developed new techniques for removing toxic contamination from cold weather environments, and the restored lake ecosystem became a living laboratory for studying environmental recovery processes. Wildlife populations in the lake region gradually recovered from the toxic contamination, and several species that had been locally extinct returned to the area within 5 years of the cleanup completion. The environmental restoration demonstrated that even severely damaged ecosystems could recover when pollution sources were eliminated and proper restoration techniques were applied. The success of the lake restoration project provided hope for other contaminated sites throughout Alaska and became a symbol of the state's commitment to environmental protection. Environmental educators regularly brought school groups to visit the lake and learn about the importance of preventing pollution and the power of individual action to create positive change. Frank Sullivan's story became part of Alaska's environmental history curriculum, taught in schools throughout the state as an example of how ordinary citizens could make extraordinary contributions to environmental protection. Students learned about Frank's courage in exposing corporate environmental crimes and his family's determination to seek justice even when faced with powerful opposition. The memorial plaque at the shores of the lake where Frank died was expanded into a larger memorial park that honors all of the victims of environmental crimes in Alaska. The park includes educational displays about the toxic waste conspiracy, the environmental damage it caused, and the cleanup efforts that restored the damaged ecosystem. Margaret Sullivan's advocacy work continued until her death in 2018, by which time she had become one of Alaska's most respected environmental activists. She had traveled throughout the United States speaking about environmental justice, had advised other families dealing with corporate environmental crimes, and had helped establish similar advocacy organizations in other states. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her advocacy work, including environmental scientists, government officials, and families of other environmental crime victims. The governor of Alaska spoke at her service, praising her transformation of personal tragedy into a powerful force for positive change that had made Alaska a safer and cleaner place for future generations. The Frank Sullivan Environmental Protection Foundation that Margaret had established continued her work after her death, providing funding for environmental research, legal assistance for environmental crime victims, and educational programs about corporate accountability and environmental justice. The foundation became one of Alaska's most influential environmental organizations and a lasting monument to both Frank's sacrifice and Margaret's advocacy. Today, a memorial plaque at the shores of the lake where Frank died honors his memory and serves as a reminder of the price that environmental protection sometimes demands. The lake itself, now cleaned and restored, has become a symbol of environmental recovery and the power of individual action to create lasting change. Margaret Sullivan lived to see her husband vindicated and his killers brought to justice. She passed away peacefully in 2018, secure in the knowledge that Frank's story would inspire future generations of environmental protectors and that his sacrifice would never be forgotten. The toxic cargo conspiracy that killed Frank Sullivan serves as a permanent reminder that environmental crime is not victimless, and that the people willing to poison our natural world for profit will also kill to protect their secrets. But it also demonstrates that truth and justice, even when delayed by decades, can ultimately prevail over even the most powerful corporate interests. Frank Sullivan's legacy lives on in the cleaner air and water of Alaska, in the stronger environmental protections that resulted from his sacrifice, and in the knowledge that one person's courage can change the world, even when that courage comes at the ultimate price. If this incredible true story of corporate conspiracy, environmental murder, and a family's 11-year fight for justice has left you questioning how many other Frank Sullivans are out there fighting against powerful interests to protect our environment, then you understand why these stories need to be told. Please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss our deep investigations into cases that prove ordinary people can make extraordinary differences, even when it costs them everything. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think about Frank Sullivan's courage and Margaret's incredible transformation from grieving widow to environmental champion. Have you ever encountered situations where you suspected environmental crimes were being covered up? Do you know of other cases where whistleblowers paid the ultimate price for trying to protect our natural world? Your engagement helps us reach more people with these important stories, and every subscription supports our mission to uncover the truth behind cases that powerful interests want to keep buried. Remember, the next time you see something that doesn't seem right in your community, Frank Sullivan's example reminds us that one person with courage can change everything. Thank you for watching, and remember that justice, no matter how long delayed, can ultimately triumph over even the most powerful corporate conspiracies. Until our next investigation, stay vigilant, stay brave, and never stop fighting for what's right.